So in keeping with market failures, we need to take a look at some of the things that result in this. Now remember, a market failure is when the market fails to capture some sort of action, activity, or transaction. Not that the market was working but then failed somehow, but rather what we're saying is it's a failure of the market to include these things in its transaction costs. So let's take a look at some of those. The first one we need to take a look at is the tragedy of the commons. The problem here is that because there is no ownership, then everyone exploits whatever this situation is. So the classic is like the Wild West. As people in America were moving westward, they had what was called open range. And anyone could go out there and graze their cattle because no one owned it. And so because there was no ownership, then it was simply left open to whoever gets there first. And so everyone sent their cows en masse out into those fields to have them grazed, because if they didn't, someone else would just send their cows to go out and graze. So I might as well just go out there and graze it and get it first before anyone else. The problem is this resulted in severe overgrazing because there was no one to actually manage it. No one owned it. And so the whole thing just got abused. And anytime you don't have ownership, it just invites everyone to come in and exploit that resource. All right? Ownership matters a lot. I mean, you think about when we're regularly in school, we constantly have a problem at the school of people throwing stuff on the ground. Garbage is everywhere. Even though there's garbage cans like every 30 feet through the hallway, a lot of people will just get done with something and just throw it on the ground. And every day there's this massive amount of paper and pencils and garbage and all kinds of stuff that's just been dropped. And the janitors have to clean it up. Basically, the taxpayer is paying them to clean it up. The reason for this is no one owns the school. It is a public school. And so because it has public ownership, everyone says, well, I own the school. It's kind of mine, and I'll just throw my stuff here because they know someone else is going to clean it up. You don't do that at your own house. I mean, if I was to come to your house and dump my garbage on your lawn, you'd get really upset. You'd call the cops. You'd come after me. I mean, there'd be repercussions because you own that house, and you don't allow me to destroy your house because you own it. But this is the problem. Who owns the commons? The answer is no one. So this is why the more common the ownership, the more abuse that it invites. Think about the national forest. There's all kinds of things that go on in the national forest because those are public lands. So people will cut down trees illegally. Marijuana grows. They will light things on fire that they shouldn't. They will dump garbage out there that they shouldn't. They will destroy the roads driving on, when it's a muddy road because it's fun, but okay, it's destroyed, but who cares because the taxpayer is going to pay for it, right? There's no ownership, and there's no way to enforce it really because they can't have rangers everywhere in the national forest, and so no one's protecting it. So of course it is exploited. It is the tragedy of the commons. So the more a society tries to incorporate this idea of we all own something, actually the less ownership you get, the less care you get. All right? Because if something is not owned, then no one cares for it. People do care for things that they own, and you want to keep that in mind when it comes to land or endangered species or something like that. If something is owned, people care for it. So private property matters a lot if you want to have a market, okay? This is not private property. And so what this results in is overfishing, overgrazing, exploitation of different species. If these things aren't owned, people will exploit them. All right? So, how do you avoid the tragedy of the commons? Private property. You've got to privatize things. All right. No ownership also means no effort. So you've heard the stories about the Pilgrims. They came over on the Mayflower. They got to America. And what happened? They couldn't survive. It was really bad. But unfortunately, you aren't really taught why, which is interesting. But if you go to the original diaries of William Bradford, you can look him up. William Bradford was the governor of the Plymouth colony, and in the first 2 years there, they tried this grand social experiment where they held everything in common. So they had all the surrounding lands around their colony. Everyone owned them equally, and everyone was supposed to go out each day and work for the good of themselves and their fellow man. It was a noble gesture, and for 2 years they faced starvation because no one put any effort into it. Everyone sat around saying, you know what, I'm going to reap the rewards of someone else working, so I'll just sit here and wait and let them work, and I'll eat off of them. And because everyone did this, no one ate, and they came close to all starving to death. So you'll note in William Bradford's journals, if you look him up, in the 3rd year, he said, all right, enough of this. We're not doing that. Everyone is allotted their private ground. And so the whole colony, everyone had their own plots of land, and they were going to live or die based on whatever happened on their land. And they would collect their food, and it would be their stuff because they owned it. Guess what happened? Well, now that they had ownership and people were facing the idea that my individual effort matters, everyone got out there and worked and worked and worked and worked and worked. And they ended up with, in their 3rd year, a huge bounty of food. And at the end, they said, you know what? We should have a Thanksgiving feast for this. Okay? So, this is the reason that we have Thanksgiving. Because William Bradford went from no ownership in commons into ownership of the land. And what did that provide? It provided incentives. And as we know, incentives matter a lot. So once the people had an incentive to work, they made it happen. And that's what brought us Thanksgiving. All right? So that's actually the real story right there. I know. You should look it up. William Bradford. Okay? The next problem we have are public goods. As I've mentioned earlier, a public good is something that is owned by a government. Right? So governments are the ones that own public goods. So if you hear about a public school, that's government run. If you hear about public lands, this is the public sidewalk. You know, those kind of things, those are all government owned and government run. And the main issue that you would want to have government at all in here is the issue of non-excludability. See, normally we'd want the market to run everything because we've got incentives, speed, efficiency, price system, chapter 6, all that stuff. All right? But what do you do about things that are non-excludable? For example, the classic would be a street light. Once someone builds a street light, then everyone passing by gets the advantage of that street light. Every driving car, every walking pedestrian. So I've got a street lamp outside my house. It's great for when I turn it on and I can go out to my car and I can see if there's any problems, like a skunk under the car, you know. I don't have street lights in my street, but I've provided one. But when I have that on, all my neighbors benefit. See, it is non-excludable. It is a positive externality. Everyone benefits, and I can't charge them for it. I can't charge them money. I can't tax them. I can't rent it to them. Whoever builds it provides a benefit to everyone and doesn't get rewarded for it. So the idea is that if that's the case, if it's non-excludable, then no one will build it. They'll all wait for someone else to build it and nothing will happen. So you won't get sidewalks, street lamps, things like that. Okay? What you're going to find, though, is there are very few of these types of public goods. And they usually are relegated to things like the sidewalk or the street lamp. They're pretty small. You know, some people will say things like, well, no one would build a bridge if it wasn't the government building it? Hang on there, because we've got the bridge at Stevenson. It's a private bridge. It was built by private funds, and they charge money to go across it. Same thing for the bridge in Hood River. Okay? So clearly bridges are built for these reasons. Well, what about roads? Well, they have toll roads all over America. You can pay to drive on these private roads. Okay? And it's a pretty easy transaction. You just have a thing on your phone, and when you drive on that road, it just charges you per mile until you get off. And you pay a few cents every time, and that's your transaction cost. So a lot of these things are not actually public goods, and probably shouldn't be public goods. So if you want a good understanding of what should and shouldn't be a public good, you should look at the preamble of our Constitution. See, our founding fathers thought about this a lot. What are actually public goods, and which ones are non-excludable so that the government has to provide them? What is the job of government then, is to provide these things? So number one, they said, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. Okay, that was the first thing they wanted. Those are courts. So no one's going to pay for the courts unless they're going to sue someone, and then in which case you don't want that person paying the judge, because that's not going to be fair. So you have to have courts existing for everyone, and that's just something government needs to provide. So the courts, all right, provide for the establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. So domestic, inside, tranquility, peace, that's going to be provided by the police. All right? Again, do you want only the people who want police coming to their house paying for it? Well, yeah, I'll pay you to arrest that guy. Well, that's not going to be very fair, okay? And so this should be a public good. Police. You've got, provide for the common defense. Well, this Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, all those, that's a government function right there, okay? And then basic rules. All right? And that was the last thing they talked about. Provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare. Now, this is what they meant when they wrote about it, basic rules. Like, the government has to decide which side of the road we're going to drive on. The left side or the right side. It doesn't matter which one, but as long we have to pick one. And that's what government does, a basic rule. The problem is basic rules then opened itself up to let's just have the government do everything. So the idea of communism. The Soviet Union took this to its extreme and said, let's just not have markets at all, because markets don't account for everything all the time. We just won't have markets anytime. We'll just run the whole thing ourselves. Well, that resulted in some big problems, starving 6 million people right off the bat, then killing another 14 million people, through death camps and slave labor. I don't think it worked out. Okay? So those are some of the problems that as soon as you get away from the markets, where do you draw this line? And our founding fathers in our country drew the line at these 4 things. Those are the public goods that have non-excludability. So a writer, I've talked about him before, I'll talk about him again, his name is Friedrich Bastiat. He wrote a book called The Law. It's 70 pages long. It's a pretty easy read and pretty good read. He challenged this idea himself at that time. He said, look, these people run around saying that I don't believe in education because I don't think the government should provide education, as if the only way it's going to get provided is if the government does it. I'm simply arguing that the market will do it better. And then he goes on to say, it's as if they won't believe in people making food unless the government makes the food. There's either the government doing it or it won't exist at all. And so he was trying to make the case that there are certain times when it's appropriate. But in most cases, it's actually not. Like building a dam. If it's worth it to build a dam, someone will build it. And then they'll charge you for the electricity, they'll charge you for the water, they'll charge you for moving a boat through the locks of the dam to go further up. All those kind of things are market-based. An airport is a private entity, okay? A seaport is, we can just go on and on. So there's a lot of things that are done by the government that our founding fathers would have said, That's a market-based thing. It's just these things right here that I offer the issue of non-excludability and have to be provided by the government. Okay? So now that you understand this framework, start looking at some of the things that we actually have out there as to whether they belong in the private sector or the public sector. The famous economist Milton Friedman said, if you can find something in the private sector in the phone book that does a certain service or activity, then it should not be done by the government because it's already there. The private sector is ready and willing to do it. For example, the U.S. Postal Service loses millions of dollars. I think last year it topped into the billions of dollars that they were losing. Do we already have private sector delivery services that are making money? FedEx? UPS? There's others in Europe that do the same thing. So if we have private companies that are doing this and doing it efficiently enough that they can do it repeatedly over the years, why do we need an inefficient service run by the government to compete with it? Okay? So that's what Milton Friedman said, and he just pointed that out. If you can find it on the phone book, just a list of businesses that do these things, if you can find it on the internet, then why is the government doing it? It shouldn't. It's part of the market and it needs to stay there. Okay? So think about these with the tragedy of the commons, these ideas of ownership versus private property, and hopefully it'll generate some discussion for class, and I'll see you then.